Make up mind. Fight.
I am a big fan of collecting physical memorabilia and merchandise for the things that I'm interested in, primarily figures, statues, and other self-indulgent terms for the word toys. I know stuff like this is pretty heavily stigmatized, like parodies of collector culture have been around for as long as collecting itself has, but to me, I just like having physical, tangible representations of the things I'm passionate about on display in my personal spaces. It just feels neat and I like it. What's worth noting though is that most figure lines and mass-produced merch lines for popular series tend to be pretty limited, be it for the thing that they're based on being intrinsically niche, a limited period of popularity, a lack of marketability on its key characters, or your favorite characters that you want to collect being somewhat obscure. Most TV, movie, and video game series tend to get pretty scattershot lineups of physical merchandise outside of their iconic key characters and concepts. Things like Star Trek, Star Wars, and Pokemon tend to be a bit lucky in this regard, but most media franchises don't fare as well. However, there is one line of figures for one very iconic piece of American media that stands as a shining example of how to make a figure line that caters to fans of that series. Everyone's favorite funny yellow family, The Simpsons, and their short-lived yet expansive World of Springfield line. Released from the very early 2000s to late 2004, and often abbreviated as WOS, the World of Springfield line is one of my favorite series of collectible figures ever made. It benefits from a lot of positives and fortunate circumstances, and encompasses pretty much every corner of the Simpsons world that you could ever want it to. Despite only running for just over 4 years, over 200 figures were released in this line, covering virtually every noteworthy character who had appeared on the show at that point. It is a truly amazing line, and to this day remains the most comprehensive lineup of Simpsons figures and collectibles ever produced. In this video, I want to go over the entire World of Springfield line, discussing each individual set, the line's history, and why it still remains such an impressive collectible line to this day. Let's grab our stockpile of tacos and meet at the Android's dungeon, because we're taking a deep dive into the World of Springfield. The World of Springfield line of figures was produced by Playmates Toys and released from January of 2000 to either September or December of 2004. The two wikis are fighting about it. Playmates Toys, of course, is a Hong Kong-based toy manufacturer known for their work on a wide variety of IPs and franchises, encompassing pretty much every base imaginable. Their most iconic collaboration would be for their work on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles license, which saw a $4 billion profit for the company during the early 90s. These days, they're primarily working on figures for TMNT and Miraculous Ladybug, and recently put out a line for the new movie TMNT Mutant Mayhem. As far as World of Springfield goes, the line was, again, produced from the early 2000s and was created with the intention of being a comprehensive, collector-focused line of Simpsons figures. Most IPs that receive merchandise tend to experience a limited period of popularity during their time in the spotlight, but due to the Simpsons' consistent popularity, iconography, and brand appeal, it was a prime candidate for a long-running figure line. Prior to World of Springfield, the Simpsons had only seen one very small line of figures in the early 90s by Mattel, so it only made sense to capitalize on the then untapped market for a dedicated line of collector-focused Simpsons figures. The line incorporated a thorough commitment to fan communication and input, with the Simpsons collector sector message boards frequently being consulted on the line by Playmates higher-ups. This allowed fans to have direct input on what figures and sets were produced, even reviving a few cancelled sets and ultimately deciding on which characters were made into figures. I feel like it's really common for these fan suggestion type of productions to ultimately devolve into angry fans voicing their disinterest, but as far as I can tell, World of Springfield remained an exception to this rule for most of its run. The angriest people got at any point was when Playmates released an exclusive variant figure through Toy Fair magazine, and people's negative responses to this practice ultimately caused Playmates to vow and make future mail-away figures more readily available. Despite the line's popularity with collectors and its vast size, it was eventually cancelled in late 2004 with no official reason given. The general consensus over the line's cancellation tends to be the sheer size of it being intimidating to prospective collectors, the late 90s boom of the US economy slowing down by the early 2000s, and fans just being fatigued from collecting such a vast lineup of figures. Regardless, the line remains the most comprehensive and popular Simpsons figure line to this day, with searching World of Springfield on secondhand seller sites still yielding thousands of results, and future figure lines simply not possessing the size and variety of World of Springfield. Now that we've discussed the line's history, let's do a general rundown of the figures themselves. World of Springfield's mission statement, as embodied by its name, was to allow fans to recreate the Simpsons world in a collectible capacity. Because of this, an absolutely massive lineup of figures was released featuring virtually every noteworthy character from the first 9 or so seasons. Certain exceptionally niche characters weren't adapted, but otherwise, if you had a favorite Simpsons character during this period, the line probably features a figure for you. This is both a blessing and a curse, as it's great for collectors and dedicated fans, but it also bloats the line significantly and causes certain sets to be incredibly lopsided in terms of their respective characters' iconography. Like, it's crazy to think that there was some underpaid sweatshop worker at one point whose job it was to create figures based on characters like Llewellyn Sinclair, Brad Goodman, and Bill and Marty. Those names only mean anything to the most diehard of Simpsons fans, and definitely give this line a very unique comprehensiveness while also limiting its broad appeal. So what could you expect when you picked up an average World of Springfield figure? Well, the box would include the character of your choice, a small lineup of character-appropriate accessories, and some advertisements on the back for other figures. All pretty standard licensed toy stuff, but World of Springfield includes a few more features than this. Nearly every figure features a digital chip on their foot that, when tapped on one of the series playsets, has a chance to produce a voice-acted sound clip from the show. Over 40 playsets were produced, and while not every character works with every set for logistical and logical reasons, there's generally a huge lineup of combinations and voice lines available, and can lead to a fun sort of mix and match type of experimentation. Depending on the character and the availability of their voice actor or actress, you'll either get a re-recorded line from the show or a line ripped straight from the show. This is one of the line's most heavily advertised features, but I feel like most dedicated collectors aren't really taking advantage of it due to the general discouragement of taking figures out of their boxes. This is obviously just a huge stereotype, and if you're not intending to resell your World of Springfield figures, I'd say crack them open and see what they have to say. I can definitely see this also making the line somewhat appealing to kids. Despite being marketed and produced primarily for collectors, the World of Springfield line are still standard-size action figures with articulation and play features, so I can definitely see kids who are fans of The Simpsons getting a lot of mileage out of them. Always remember not to gatekeep what are effectively literal toys from the children in your lives. It's what separates the normal people from the Big Al's or comic book guys of the collectors community. And yeah, that's pretty much a rundown of the World of Springfield line's history and nature as a toy line. However, we're not nearly done, as I want to go through the entire line with each set individually. I want to go through each individual series, playset, and mail-away figure, and discuss just what makes this line so special and unique on a case-by-case basis. We'll be doing this in a few sections, first discussing the full figure series releases, then playsets, then exclusive and mail-away figures, finally finishing off with confirmed, cancelled, or unproduced figures. This is a big line, so let's get cracking. The World of Springfield line originally dropped in January of 2000 with a set composed of 6 figures. Despite logic dictating that you would include all 5 original main Simpson family members in this set, they actually sprung for 2 secondary characters instead, with the rest of the line being padded out by main family members. We have Homer, Bart, Lisa, and Abe Simpson being represented, with Charles, Montgomery Burns, and Krusty the Clown also included. I think this makes a degree of sense. Excluding Marge and Maggie from the set is a little bit weird, but if you were going to include any secondary characters, I think Krusty and Mr. Burns were definitely the best choice. They're among the most iconic and recognizable characters on the show who aren't Simpsons. All in all, I'd say this initial series makes sense. While I did mention we'd be skipping over the playsets for the most part in this initial section, I do want to mention that Marge and Maggie were released a month later in the very next set in February of 2000, relegated to a Simpson living room playset that included both of them. I guess this does make sense. They probably left them out of the first set because they explicitly wanted someone in the Simpson house playset who would make contextual sense to be there, and I guess withholding them from the initial series was their best way of going about that. Following this, in August of 2000, was the Series 2 set, which started several very noteworthy trends that would continue for pretty much the entire rest of this line. That is, a huge focus on secondary characters and variant figures of Simpson family members. This set specifically includes Pin Pal Homer and Sunday Best Bart, and also Barney, Ned Flanders, Smithers, and Chief Wiggum. It is a little strange to have Smithers here and not have Mr. Burns included, and I think you could have realistically fit Chief Wiggum, Flanders, or Barney in the initial set and not had them out of place. The inclusion of specifically Pin Pal Homer is also a little puzzling as their first choice for a variant figure of Homer. This isn't an outfit Homer wears particularly often in the series, and doesn't jump out at me as one of his most iconic or recognizable looks. The Sunday Best Bart does make sense though. In January of 2001, a year after the line started, we got Series 3 of the generic figures, this time including new variants for Homer and Bart being Camp Krusty Bart and Sunday Best Homer, as well as new secondary characters in Moe, Nelson, Milhouse, and Otto. Nelson and Milhouse make a lot of sense, as aside from Bart and Lisa, none of the Springfield Elementary gang had been released at this point, and Moe Sislak makes a lot of sense as a secondary character to include in one of the early sets. He's one of the most prolific characters on the show, especially in the later seasons. Otto seems like kind of an odd choice this early on. It feels like there's a few more noteworthy characters they could have introduced, but he's also a very iconic Simpsons character, so I do understand why they included him. Next up was Series 4 of the generic figures, released in April of 2001, this time including Underwear Homer, Patty Bouvier, Lenny, Ralph, Groundskeeper Willie, and Itchy and Scratchy as bonus characters. You might be noticing a trend here of each of these sets including at least one variant of either Homer or Bart, and this will continue until at least Series 7 of the generic figures. I'd assume the reason they did this was to increase marketability and profitability. They probably didn't want to include a set this early on just with a bunch of no-name secondary characters, so I guess I can understand why they've made so many different variations of Homer. We'll see even more later on, but for now, Underwear Homer makes a lot of sense. His iconic tidy whities are a really key part of his character and a lot of iconography, and the others in this set all make sense. Patty being a standalone character is a little weird, but we'll discuss that more in detail later on, and Groundskeeper Willie, Lenny, and Ralph are all very, very important to the Simpsons series, so their inclusions make sense as well. Next up, in July of 2001, we got Series 5, which includes Bartman, Kent Brockman, Martin, the Sea Captain, Bumblebee Man, and Sideshow Mel. This set is a bit of a turning point, as this is when we start going from very, very iconic key secondary characters to much more niche throwaway joke characters that the show itself tends to use more sparingly. Characters like Kent Brockman make sense, but the inclusion of one-note joke characters like the Sea Captain and Bumblebee Man definitely keys us into the fact that they were starting to run low on characters to make figures out of. That said, the rest of these characters are super iconic in their own right, and I'm very surprised it took this long to get a Bartman figure considering how much of a big deal he seemed to be in the 90s. Later on, in September of 2001, we'd get Series 6 of the generic figures, this time composed again of one generic Simpson family member with a variant outfit, as well as several random secondary characters. This is also of note for being the Black Person set, as this is the first set outside of a specific Apu Quickie Mart playset that was released earlier in the entire line that includes non-white characters. It's a little weird that they were all bunched together into one set, but either way, it's cool to have them, and I couldn't imagine having a line like this without characters like Dr. Hibbert and Carl Carlson included. Either way, this set includes Dancin' Homer, the aforementioned Hibbert and Carl, Professor Frank, Snake Jailbird, and weirdly Bleeding Gums Murphy. Bleeding Gums Murphy makes this entire set a little bit lopsided, as he's literally a character that the show killed off in his second appearance, and then made a joke later on about nobody liking, but he's also absolutely the kind of character I can see diehard Simpsons fans wanting to collect, so his inclusion does make sense. Skipping over a few playsets and mail-away figures, we've arrived at Series 7 of the generic figures. This is noteworthy for being the first set that doesn't include a variation of either Homer or Bart, instead opting for a variant of Marge, which is really cool to see even this late in the line. We got Police Officer Marge from the Springfield Connection, Dolph Cletus, Hans Moleman, Officer Lou, and Edna Krabappel. This is another set that really feels kind of lopsided. Characters like Edna and Cletus would be very important to the show's run at different points, and would become very iconic characters in their own rights, whereas Dolph and Lou feel as though they're kind of just there to fill space. They're characters that are best known for their tertiary relationships with other characters, and Hans Moleman is just kind of funny. I love that somewhere in the world there's a figure of Hans Moleman that's probably rotting in a ditch somewhere. Either way, this is a cool set, and I'm glad to see these characters represented. Next up is one of the more noteworthy sub-series of these figures, being a more limited line that were produced specifically to capitalize on the toy's talking capabilities by including characters who were voiced by noteworthy famous celebrities. In this case, we have Celebrity Series 1, including Phil Hartman's Troy McClure, Joe Mantegna's Fat Tony, and Danny DeVito's Herb Powell. This one's a little bit funny, as I feel like Herb was very transparently included to get some kind of a Homer lookalike in the set, but Fat Tony and Troy McClure especially are really cool characters to have figures of. I actually went out of my way to get the Troy figure just because he's an iconic cult classic character, and it's really cool to have a figure of him in existence at all. I actually really like the Celebrity series. We'll get more into these later on in the video, and I think this is a strong first outing for it. Next up, released in March of 2002, is Series 8 of the generic figures, which very transparently feels like it's filling out the Springfield Elementary lineup. We've got Daredevil Bart from the episode named, obviously, Bart the Daredevil. We've got Kearney, Ooter, and Sherry and Terry to represent kid characters, and Musclebound Willie and Superintendent Chalmers to round out the adult characters. I think it's very funny that a figure of Superintendent Chalmers exists, considering this character's meme status nowadays. I can't imagine too many people were desperately trying to scoop this thing up before the steamed hams days, and the rest of these characters, with exception to maybe Musclebound Willie and Kearney, are just kind of random Springfield Elementary background characters. I can't imagine too many people were scooping these figures up prior to the steamed hams meme, unless they were trying to complete their collection or were just really big fans of Sherry and Terry for some reason. Next up, in June of 2002, we got our first variant figures of Lisa and Grandpa, as well as variant figures of two secondary characters in Series 9. We got Sunday Best Lisa and Grandpa, Busted Krusty, and Prisoner Sideshow Bob, as well as Rod and Todd Flanders and Disco Stu to round out the lineup. This is a super interesting lineup of figures, as it feels like the inclusions of Criminal Krusty and Sideshow Bob were explicitly meant to pad out what were otherwise probably perceived as not very marketable characters. Make no mistake, I love Lisa and Grandpa Simpson, but Rod and Todd Flanders and Disco Stu really don't have the star power that any of the other characters in this lineup do, and I think the inclusions of variant Krusties and Sideshow Bob in this set really help articulate that. Next up is Celebrity Series 2, which is funny for being the absolute most lopsided and unbalanced lineup of these figures ever released, and it came out in June of 2002. It includes the icon, the legend, the absolutely brilliant character, Brad Goodman, voiced by Albert Brooks from the Season 5 episode, Bart's Inner Child, and Lionel Hutz, voiced by Phil Hartman, who's one of the most iconic secondary characters of the first 9 seasons. Now, if you were a Simpsons fan in the early 2000s, and you had to choose between a figure of a character who had appeared in one episode, who didn't have a single joke in that episode, who's voiced by an actor who voiced several more iconic characters in the series, multiple of which got figures, or a character voiced by Phil Hartman, who would you choose? Yeah, sorry, Lionel Hutz is kind of beating Albert Brooks with his hand behind his back here, and I can absolutely understand why everyone sprung for the Lionel Hutz figure and nobody sprung for the Brad Goodman figure. And our immediate next set is another Celebrity Series, this one also being incredibly lopsided. This one includes Hank Scorpio, voiced by Albert Brooks, who, unlike Brad Goodman, is a very iconic and well-beloved funny character, as well as Llewellyn Sinclair and Cooter. Now, I will be completely honest, I did not know Llewellyn Sinclair was voiced by a celebrity, and I've only watched Bart Carney once in my entire life, so I had no idea Cooter had any sort of a special voice actor. The fact that he got a figure at all is a little bit of a miracle, considering how much the rest of the set seems to focus on classic-era Simpsons, and he's a distinctively Season 9 character, but this really tells you how much they were running low on characters to make figures out of. I can't imagine too many kids or collectors were really chomping at the bit for figures based on Llewellyn Sinclair and Cooter of all characters, but the Hank Scorpio figure is pretty cool, and I can realistically see myself picking it up sometime soon. In October of 2002, we received Series 10, which is noteworthy for being a set primarily composed of variant figures, which reinforces a lot of what we've already said here. Out of new characters, we only got Marvin Monroe and Wendell, who are very, very funny pics that reek of desperation, as well as variant figures of Ned Flanders, Smithers, Marge, and Homer. I think the inclusion of Stonecutter's Homer is a really cool addition here, as well as Scout Leader Ned Flanders, but man, is this a set where you can tell they were running on empty with these figures. Nothing really special of note here, sadly. In December of 2002, we got Series 11, which, unlike the previous set, does include a few noteworthy secondary characters and much fewer variant figures. This set includes Rainier Wolfcastle, Gil, the blue-haired lawyer, Plow King Barney, Kirk Van Houten, and interestingly, Larry Burns. Larry Burns, I'm surprised, wasn't included in a Celebrity Series set, considering that his entire episode is basically one big Rodney Dangerfield jerk-off fest, but otherwise, this is a pretty cool set. Getting figures of Rainier Wolfcastle, Gil, and Kirk feels really cool. The Plow King is an iconic outfit of Barney's and probably his first noteworthy appearance in the series, and despite being comparatively more niche, the blue-haired lawyer and Larry Burns are cool to see get figures of for dedicated fans. Next up is Series 12, released in April of 2003, also known as the Who set, as in this set includes a few random no-name one-off characters that I'm very surprised anyone ever considered giving figures to, let alone reaching the production line. It includes Don Vittorio DiMaggio, who appeared in Homie the Clown, Number 1, the leader of the Stonecutters, who appeared in Homer the Great, as well as Luann Van Houten, Dewey Largo, and Database, as well as Mr. Plow Homer. This set is hilarious. The inclusions of figures of Don Victorio and number 1 of all characters is absolutely hysterical. I can't imagine many people were really desperately wanting figures of these characters, and the fact that merchandise of them at all exists is very funny. Database is a funny inclusion as well, considering that it's well documented that Matt Groening hates this character. I bet they really had to twist his arm to allow a figure of him to get made, and Mr. Largo and Luann's entire jokes on the show is that they suck, so all in all, this is a very funny set. Next up is Series 13, released in July of 2003, which really helped me realize that they had fully retired the Celebrity Series line at this point, as this set literally includes a figure of a celebrity, not even a character voiced by a celebrity. This line includes Helen Lovejoy, performer Krusty, Legs, Princess Cashmere, Freddie Quimby, and most notably, Professor Stephen Hawking, like the Simpsons version of the real-world guy. This is an incredibly bizarre set, all things considered. Helen Lovejoy is really the only character in here who feels like she makes any degree of sense to get a standalone figure, considering that she is a recurring character with multiple important roles in the series. By comparison, Legs is just one of Fat Tony's goons. Princess Cashmere and Freddie Quimby are very low-key characters with very few appearances each. Tuxedo Krusty is just a variant figure, and once again, Stephen Hawking, despite being a very respectable guy who lived a long life and had a lot of great contributions to science, is a real-world guy who got merchandise of his Simpsons version produced. This is all around just an incredibly bizarre series. In October of 2003, we got Series 14, which includes Luigi, Mrs. Botts, Louie, the Sarcastic Guy, Miss Hoover, and Scotsman Willie. Again, this is a really eclectic lineup of characters, varying in their recognizability and iconography. Louie's entire joke on the show is that he's again one of Fat Tony's goons. Luigi is a one-note stereotype. Miss Hoover is a generic teacher character. The Sarcastic Guy, I feel, is too niche to really be recognizable. He's a character whose voice they've given to other characters at other points and doesn't even have a consistent name. Mrs. Botts was a season 1 one-off, who I feel like got a figure specifically because her episode is the first one ever produced, and Willie is just a variant figure. I've said this a few times in the video already, but you can really tell they were running out of steam here. Next up is Series 15, released in January of 2004, which, if you can believe me, is the second to last full series of figures we ever got for this line. Notable as it includes 3 variant figures, a weird compilation figure, as well as 2 tertiary characters who are only primarily known at this point for their relationships with other characters. As far as variants go, we got Deep Space Homer, Handsome Mo, and Worst Episode Ever Comic Book Guy, as well as Brandine Spuckler and Majula Nahasapima Petalon, who are also known for being Cletus and Apu's wives, respectively, and Apu's kids. We've said this a few times already, but this is just an insane lineup of characters to get figures. The fact that they crammed all 8 of Apu's kids into a cradle and put them in a figure and called it a day is pretty nuts, and I guess releasing them standalone without Manjula would have been perceived as pretty weird, so it makes sense why they did it. The rest of these are just bizarre. Brandine would go on to become a very recognizable character, but in 2004, I don't know if she was important enough on the show yet to need a figure. Handsome Mo is just a weird pull from a random mid-season episode. Deep Space Homer makes sense, as that was a very iconic episode for its time. And Worst Episode Ever Comic Book Guy, just feels like they're trying to objectify Comic Book Guy's catchphrase outside of a t-shirt by putting a t-shirt of it on a figure of him. Remarkable. And lastly is Series 16, released in June of 2004, which was the very last full set of figures released for this series. This set includes the 3 nerds from Homer Goes to College, Artie Ziff, Agnes Skinner, Bart when he went on the Squishy Bender that one time in Season 5, and Devil Homer. This set is the ultimate testament to the fact that they were fully out of steam. We got a variant Homer who's from a weird mid-season episode. We got Bart not even in a different outfit, just with a different facial expression. A trio of 3 characters who were only known for being a trio of 3 characters from a generally well-liked early season episode, Artie Ziff, who's a celebrity character who had barely appeared in the series up to this point, and Agnes, who I guess makes sense. Yeah, you can really tell they were out of characters at this point. But we're not done, as we have a few more categories to discuss, starting with the playsets. I feel like these, for the most part, did a better job of justifying their own existence through consistently including more important and recognizable characters. Part of this is due to the fact that most of these released with only 1 or 2 characters at a time, but regardless, let's get started talking about those with Series 1. We had previously mentioned the Marge and Maggie Simpson living room playset, but there's also a Springfield Power Plant Radioactive Homer playset that's pretty cool and I like. Following this, we got the Series 2 playsets, which included Apu in the Quickie Mart and Principal Skinner in the Springfield Elementary School. I'm mixed on this as a whole. It's cool to see some of these characters be given more grandiose spectacle by releasing with full playsets, but it also limited the availability of these figures through some pretty noteworthy and iconic characters being released solely through more expensive, bigger, and harder to store playsets rather than individually. Regardless, it's cool to see these characters represented. Apu and Skinner are probably some of the most iconic secondary characters on the show, and it's really cool to see merchandise of them being produced on this scale. I myself own the Skinner figure, and I don't own the playset anymore because my niece broke it, but I do still consider it one of the hallmarks of my collection. We're going to be taking the playsets a little quicker, as most of them include one character each and thus can be spoken about in a lot less detail. The Series 3 and 4 playsets include Mayor Quimby in Springfield Town Hall, the default Sideshow Bob in Crustaloo Studios, the Androids Dungeon and Comic Book Guy, and Barney's Bolorama with Pin Pal Apu. I think it's very funny that the Barney's Bolorama playset does not include Barney, but rather a variant figure of Apu. This makes it the first playset to come with a variant figure, which in my opinion automatically lessens its value a little bit. But the other characters are all really iconic. Getting figures of Sideshow Bob and Comic Book Guy specifically feel like big hallmarks for this set, and the release of a Diamond Joe Quimby figure is pretty cool, even if he's one of my less liked characters on the show. I'd like to stop down real quick to discuss some store-exclusive, limited, or otherwise harder to find figures in this set that were released at specific retailers and not made available elsewhere outside of secondhand sellers. These are not categorized as playsets, but rather individual diorama sets that were retailer exclusive. Starting with Toys R Us, we have a Treehouse of Horror themed set with Homer, Kang, and Kodos. We have a Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire Christmas themed set that includes the only Santa's Little Helper figure we got. We have a Colonel Homer themed Lurleen Lumpkin and Colonel Homer figure that's also the only Lurleen figure we got. We have a Halloween themed Treehouse of Horror set that includes Hugo, Donut Head Homer, Freddy Krueger Groundskeeper Willie, and Witch Marge. We have a Life on the Fast Lane themed Barney's Bolorama set, which includes the only Jock figure we got, as well as Bowler Marge. We have a Main Street set that includes the only Old Jewish Man and Squeaky Voice teen figures we got. We have a Times Square New Year's Eve set that includes variant figures of all of the Simpsons and was also released in November rather than December or New Year's Day. We have another Treehouse of Horror set that includes superhero and supervillain versions of a lot of the characters, including an exclusive Lucy Lawless figure. We have a currently not very important, but later on will be very important set, including all of the B-Sharps and Dr. Dolittle Chief Wiggum. And we have a very cool Tracy Ullman themed set that includes the Simpsons classic designs rather than their more recognizable ones that I think is really neat and the kind of thing that only the Simpsons would produce. EB Games also gave us a few exclusive sets, including a Radioactive Man and Fallout Boy set, which also includes the only variant Millhouse we ever got, a The Way We Was themed Homer and Marge from their 70s prom, a KBBL radio including Bill and Marty, which is probably the most niche and obscure out of any of these figures in the entire line. These characters are mostly vocal, talking over the radio with very few physical appearances in the series, a very cool Moe's Tavern and Duffman themed set, which I believe is one of the only sets to actively referenced Duff, and a future Mr. Burns and Smithers, as well as a Bobo Smithers set based on the famous episode Rosebud. And for a few other niche oddities that aren't categorized with the rest of the figures, we have a school bus set that includes most of the Springfield Elementary Kid figures and Otto. We have a weirdly red rather than pink family car set that includes the entire Simpsons family. We have a KB Toys exclusive set that includes a few comic book specific variants of already released characters. And we have a few specific dioramas that include reissues of previously released figures. Other than that, all we've got left is the remaining series playsets and the mail-away figures, so let's get cracking. For the rest of the playsets, we're just going to go down the line here and talk about them individually, as they're all only one character each and include a background that is fitting to that character. For the Series 6 playsets, we have the First Church of Springfield and the Arcade, including Reverend Lovejoy and Jimbo. For the Series 7 playsets, we have the Simpsons Kitchen and Krusty Burger, including Moo Moo Homer and a variant Squeaky Voice teen. For the Series 8 playsets, we have Selma, who rounds out the previously alone Patty figure, and Lunch Lady Doris in the Springfield DMV and Springfield Elementary cafeteria. For the Series 9 playsets, we have Officer Eddie and Jasper Beardley in the Springfield Jail and Retirement Castle, respectively. For the Series 10 playsets, we have Mr. Burns' Manor and the Springfield Hospital with a pajama Mr. Burns and Dr. Nick figure. For the Series 11 playsets, we have a Judge Roy Snyder and Springfield Court. For the Series 12 playset, we have a variant Bart as well as Bart's Treehouse. For the Series 13 playsets, we have one of my personal favorites, which is Herman and Herman's Military Antiques, who's a character I've always loved due to to how much of a nobody edgelord he is compared to everyone else on the show. For Series 14, we have Rainier Wolfcastle as McBain and the Springfield Cineplex. For the Series 15 playset, we have a very cool one, including the Springfield Power Plant Lunchroom and a Frank Grimes figure, which I'm certain people are very eager to throw into their nearest electrical socket. And the final playset release was Jebediah Springfield with Springfield Town Square. Overall, I'd say the playsets do a better job of consistently providing iconic characters and locations than the individual series sets do. The series sets often encounter problems with meaninglessly padding out their lineups of characters and variants that nobody would really care about due to needing to release 5 to 6 figures a set, whereas the requirement to only release 1 or 2 figures of each of these really helped them keep the bloat down. I could realistically see myself wanting to own all of these, and while some of them, like the DMB, don't sound very appealing to the prospect of a child playing with toys, for collectors, I think these are pretty cool. And as our second to last lineup are the mail-away figures. These were the most controversial figures released as a part of the World of Springfield line, requiring mailing away to either Toy Fair magazine or an official website in order to obtain them, resulting in a lot of these figures being much rarer and more valuable than things that came before and after them. These were often variant figures of already existing characters in different outfits or with different effects, and are generally not too worth going after these days unless you're a diehard fan of the episode they're representing. In order, we have a Toy Fair radioactive glow-in-the-dark Homer, a Pin Pal Mr. Burns, a boxing Homer, a convention comic book guy, which I'm pretty sure is literally just a normal comic book guy with a logo printed on his shirt, B Sharp's figures of Homer, Apu, Barney, and Principal Skinner. These are noteworthy, as I mentioned before, due to a full B Sharp's collection being released later on that basically invalidated these figures as far as I can tell, as well as Stonecutter's versions of Mo and Lenny that were intended to be accompanied by further Stonecutter versions of characters later down the line that were cancelled. Again, these mail-away figures were pretty controversial as they not only bloated the line with useless variants, but were also generally harder to obtain than the other figures, commanding higher prices on the secondhand market and often being incredibly limited. They eventually stopped producing these, though at that point the set was pretty much already over, so it wasn't really worth much. And lastly, we gotta talk about canceled figures, which is good both for the YouTube algorithm and for preservation's sake. As far as individual figures go, we have a Rabbi Krostovsky figure, which was actually advertised on the back of some figures, but was ultimately canceled due to them not being able to clear the rights for Jackie Mason's voice. A Lyle Lanley figure, which was tragically cut and replaced with Cooter in the Series 3 Celebrity line. We had a Malloy figure from the episode Homer the Vigilante, which was replaced by Number 1. And we had a Stonecutter Wiggum mail-away figure, which was canceled when World of Springfield ended. For playsets, we had a Flanders house with Maude Flanders, an elementary school playground with Janie, a Stonecutter hall with Stonecutter Carl, an Oval Office playset with older Lisa, Homer, Marge, Bart, and Maggie, as well as an interesting 300-episode Spectacular Bart's Loft playset, which included Skateboarding Homer, Pajama Bart, Indian Burn Lisa, and Casual Skinner, which as far as I can tell from the mock-up was canceled due to extremely negative backlash from fans. And going by the designs for some of these figures, I'm not surprised by that. Almost seems like a tongue-in-cheek joke set. And lastly, there were a few waves that were canceled, including figures of Ninja Bart, Richard Lewis, Arnie Pie, Bigfoot Homer, Flying Hellfish Grandpa, Cecil Terwilliger, Sideshow Bob's brother, Lindsay Neagle, Tuxedo King and Kodos, Uncle Mo's Family Feed Bag Mo, Sanjay Nahasapima Petalon, and Akira. And that pretty much encompasses the World of Springfield line. One of the most impressive, comprehensive, and collectible series of figures ever released for a single television series that was also significantly hampered by severe bloat, a lack of clear direction on what characters were and weren't worth making into figures, a ton of unnecessary promotions and mail-away figures, and just an all-around lack of individual polish on the figures. Overall, I'm still very, very, very positive on World of Springfield. It's ultimately one of my favorite figure lines that's ever been released, and the amount of iconic beloved characters that I'm able to have tangible merchandise of through this line is really cool. However, I can also see why the line didn't really take off and why after a bit they ran out of recognizable characters to make into figures. If you're interested in collecting World of Springfield figures after watching this video, you're in luck. To quote the Real Jims on Simpsons Comics, the barrier to entry for collecting these figures is super low. I was able to order my Troy McClure figure for about $15 completely complete in box and in great shape. As long as you're not going after the mail-away figures, these are not terribly expensive to start collecting. So if you're at all a collector who wants to pick up a figure of your favorite character, be it Mrs. Bott, Brad Goodman, or Llewellyn Sinclair, you probably can do so with a quick eBay search. Overall, I'd love to see another figure line as comprehensive as the World of Springfield be released, maybe with a bit more oversight and clear direction, and a more concise way of releasing figures outside of bloated full sets. Either way, hope you enjoyed, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Thanks and cheers.